In this presentation, today's featured speakers, Dr. Anton Chuvakin, recognized security expert in the field of log management, SIM, and PCI-DSS compliance, and Mel Shakir, CTO at NitroSecurity, will cover the requirements, capabilities, and benefits of this new compliance model. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first featured speaker, Dr. Anton Chuvakin.
Hello, everybody. My name is Anton Chuvakin, and today we're going to explore the subject of proactive or continuous compliance. And there's a lot of controversy in the security industry in regards to continuous approach to compliance. So we're going to try to explore and figure out what the reality is. Specifically, the outline for today would be security and or versus equal, not equal, all this stuff about relating security to compliance. And by the way, there's a lot of discussion in the industry about that. So we might give you some new ways to look at the question of what are you doing for security, what are you doing for compliance, and whether those are the same. We can also explore the main subject, proactive or continuous compliance. As you know, many organizations today sadly approach compliance as something they do only to avoid auditors, or in case of PCI, assessors. So the projects to do compliance are seen as just standalone compliance projects to avoid the wrath of auditors. So this clearly isn't a continuous approach. This is more of an annual or periodic approach to compliance. Can this change? Can this be updated to be more useful for security? Continuous compliance or continuous view of compliance is one such approach. And also we're going to share some tips about how to actually do continuous compliance, provided you decide to do that. So before we start exploring the subject, I wanted to step away from the whole security compliance, hacking, intrusions, PCI industry, and step away and think, when you get in your car and you buckle or maybe not buckle your seatbelt, why do you do that? Do you do that because you want to avoid or reduce, rather, the risk of dying in a car crash, or maybe the risk of suffering some kind of an injury, or do you do that because you might get caught? And to me, everybody who is thinking about security and compliance or doing security and compliance should first answer this question: why are we doing it? Are you buckling your seatbelt to not die? Which is really kind of more of a metaphor for continuous compliance, because you have to do it all the time. You cannot do it once a year. You cannot do it every other day. You have to do it all the time. Or you're doing it to just avoid the risk of a fine. And obviously, if you know there's some place where police might be hiding, or there's some other increased chance of being fined for not wearing a seatbelt, you'll just buckle it there and then unbuckle it in other places. So, why are you doing it? While you're thinking about this, let's go back to the main flow of our conversation. At this point, I wanted to remind people about PCI, Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, which has been combined from individual card brand standards a few years ago. And the focus of PCI is obviously reducing the risk of card transactions and helping the card brands run efficient and secure electronic payments. Now, there are many, many other side effects, side goals, and things around PCI. But this is the primary one slide, so to say, view. What is PCI-DSS? Now, an important distinction in regards to PCI-DSS is the following. When we say PCI or PCI-DSS, we often mean one of two things. We might mean a document that you can download off the PCI Council website, PCI-DSS guidance, 12 requirements, 220-something sub-requirements. And PCI-DSS would apply to just a document. Sometimes when you say PCI, you mean the whole regime, the whole payment card industry compliance regime of QSA assessments, self-assessment questionnaires, acquiring banks, issuing banks, merchant service providers, and all this stuff. So sometimes PCI is used sort of to mean one or another. In this case, when we talk about PCI compliance, we mean complying with the document and satisfy the requirements of the regulatory regime. For example, various merchant levels, you know, you have to do somewhat different things to validate compliance. And by the way, while we're on the subject, there's one little thing that I always have to remind people, because I still hear it after so many years that if you don't become compliant, you're going to get fined by the council. That thing just completely does not exist. PCI Council does not fine anybody. It doesn't have any enforcement authority. If you're a vendor and you're telling your customers be compliant or the council would fine you, that's a bit of a mistake. Now, there are PCI fines for sure. They just aren't applied by the PCI Council, but by card brands and sometimes by acquirers against merchants. So this is part of the whole ecosystem of PCI-DSS. Now, another reminder, 6 domains, 12 requirements. And by the way, this picture is unchanged since the times of PCI 1.2, and the current version that I would talk about a little bit more on further slides does have the same 6 domains and the same 12 specific requirements. We will talk a bit more about the individual changes and details and so what happened when PCI went 2.0. In fact, we get it right now. Now, many of the so-called PCI experts, as well as merchants having to become compliant and maintain compliance, have poured through the changes, through the change document released by the council, as well as through the standard itself, as well as through all the noise in the media, in the industry, in regards to PCI 2.0 changes. Now, I like to think of PCI 2.0 as PCI 1.2.2, because the changes are kind of slight. There are no sweeping changes, and that's a good thing, believe it or not. Changing PCI, or the perception that PCI changes, has been a mass annoyance for many merchants. So as a result, PCI 2.0 does have a lot of useful clarifications. I'm not going to go through all the details. I'm going to highlight some interesting things that I found kind of curious. If you want to go see what they are, just check out the council website, and don't go for the standard itself in this case. Look for the changes document, and there are many, many other industry sources that cover the changes and focus on what was interesting to a particular commentator. In my case, the most important one, or to me, was the virtualization side, because for many years people were complaining to the council that PCI does not cover virtualization. Moreover, some of the requirements seem to have been interpreted as virtualization would make you not compliant. Now, all this is now over because PCI 2.0 does have references to virtualization, and you can see how to do it in a compliant way. There are many other clarifications. Another interesting one that I want to highlight is the one that applies to scoping. There are a couple of references to having to actually check for cardholder data on systems, as opposed to just do the scoping of the document. I'm pretty sure there are some technology providers who are rejoicing over that requirement. And that's a good thing also. That's actually looking for the data outside of the perceived scope is kind of useful. There are a few other clarifications as far as the data storage, what is allowed, what's prohibited. And to me, scoping clarifications are useful, and how people would scope, how people would make decisions, what's in PCI scope, what's not. By the way, as you know, Council has a scope in SIG, or special interest group, that is developing better scoping guidelines that will be released in the coming years. As some of you know, PCI-DSS has a sister standard called PA-DSS, the Payment Application Data Security Standard. This applies to individual applications that actually do processing, not just systems, not just databases where the data is stored, but applications. And I'm not highlighting as many changes in PA-DSS, but I'm highlighting some of the interesting ones. Now, most of you who actually know about PCI and PA-DSS would really kind of laugh at the first clarification. Use of PA-DSS compliant application alone does not make an entity PCI-DSS compliant. Now, to me, to you, to most of the audience, it's really kind of obvious. Well, these are two different standards. If you use a PA-DSS compliant app, then maybe you're compliant with PA-DSS, but not with PCI. However, many of us in the field have seen multiple crowds of merchants who really still think that I got a PA-DSS app, I'm PCI compliant, which is a little bit insane. So the wise council folks decided to make a very direct statement. No, it does not. It also covered some of the interesting things in regards to login, obviously my favorite subject, as you can guess. New requirements to require payment applications to facilitate centralized login in alignment with PCI. That's a very important hole that was closed, because in the past you'd think that PCI-DSS requirements for application login, tracking access to data, and all the other nice and useful requirement 10 and other things would apply automatically to payment apps. And they were. However, many people weren't treated like this, and now if people are trying to certify their payment application to be compliant with PCI-DSS, they have to have login. That's a good thing, and it would definitely send much more application logs towards the SIM and log management vendors. So, as I mentioned, many people treat PCI as well as other compliance mandates as something that is done for the auditors. In fact, this picture is obviously quite humorous, but I've seen a merchant, more than a few merchants, who would be really grappled by intense fear that they're coming. And no, that wouldn't be some other evil presence of aliens. It would really just be the QSA or the QSA team for large merchants to do an assessment and possibly find them not compliant. So if PCI is done out of fear of QSA, a lot of things happen, and let's explore some of those things and see how they affect what's going on and how it affects security as well. And then we're going to get to the subject of continuous compliance as opposed to a mad dash compliance, as I would call it. So after you survive your fear of QSA encounter and your assessment is done, well, and hopefully you're found compliant, or maybe you found not compliant and then you close the gap and then eventually found compliant. What happens after QSA leaves? It's quite obvious that PCI compliance does not end when a QSA leaves or self-assessment questionnaire is submitted. You get validated every year, but you have to become compliant, or be compliant actually, all the time. So you can use what you built for PCI for other purposes, but you also have to maintain the defenses, the controls, the other things. So you have to really own PCI, and that will be the theme throughout the presentation, that to become compliant and to not be one of those companies that were found to be breached and then not compliant at the time of the breach, which is not as controversial as some people think. You have to own PCI, you have to operationalize it, and that will be the subject of our discussion. How do you actually own PCI? How do you make it something that you do or you live, maybe even, pretty much every day? And I noticed that not that many QSAs would check for whether your compliance program, that you have a compliance program. They might check the instant state of your controls and situation and say, okay, you got it, you would get validated today. However, some of the better QSAs would certainly check for whether you're wired for continuous compliance. And that's absolutely your choice to pick one of that sort. While we're talking about assessments, we do know that today, as of 2011, as of PCI 2.0, your assessment, your validation is annual for QSA as well as self-assessment questionnaires, and quarterly in the form of vulnerability scanning. So what do we learn here? You can do or not do compliance every day. So as I was saying, specifically inside PCI, there are requirements for tasks that you would do pretty much annually, quarterly, weekly, and daily. So when people start falling under the impression that PCI is done only for the assessment, there's a direct contradiction of that right inside the DSS. And to me, that's actually kind of annoying that many organizations choose to use PCI as only an annual affair, despite the fact that PCI itself gives them things to do every day. Specifically, daily log review is a really interesting subject if you bring it up with some of the merchants. They become shy, they start hiding under their desks, and explaining how daily log review, is just not something that is possible in their environment, despite the requirement to do it in PCI. And by the way, I'm not talking about some kind of a corner gas station or a coffee shop. I'm talking about a large companies that have to go through assessments, which means they're either level 1s or larger level 2, larger level 2s that volunteer to do a QSA assessment occasionally. So the only way to start doing those tasks which are ongoing, daily, weekly, is to operationalize compliance. Build it in a continuous program and then use it for other things should you choose to do it. And then you end up with a compliance program that not only gets you compliant, not only gets you validated, not only gets you compliant, but also helps a lot with security. And by the way, that message is not very easy to sell in many cases because people just don't want to do that. So what are some of the arguments to actually get organizations, get the management to see the need for continuous compliance? Let's start from a somewhat humorous note. If you ask people, would you like to get rich or stay rich? Most CEOs and most managers and actually most humans would say, yeah, both. And how come that the same question, would you like to get compliant with PCI or stay compliant? Well, to be really honest, they would say that they don't really like to get compliant. They think they have to get compliant, but somehow they don't think they have to stay compliant. That is the interesting part. However, getting compliance as a focus is quite a mistake, quite like if getting rich but not staying rich would be a focus. This type of metaphor is probably not going to convince all the senior managers. And as a result, what we get in many organizations is a situation when the companies play whack and assessor. They fix an issue, they polish their environment, they paint the grass, they do all the things to make it look good before the assessment, and then things slowly decay, get changed, duct tape gets peeled off, and the environment falls back into non-compliance. One of the best examples that I have comes from my PCI book co-author, Brandon Williams, from one of his presentations back in the day. This is really a classic example that I've seen as well, and I'm sure Brandon has seen his fair share of these organizations, where the company has PCI as a bi-weekly, no, not bi-weekly, but annual project for 2 weeks, and then they fall out of compliance for most of the year. Clearly there are no processes. Compliance is viewed as some kind of a check, and obviously annual check, which leads to breaches, issues, data loss, embarrassing media exposure, and all the usual stuff. No operational, no continuous, no proactive compliance. Compliance is seen as some kind of a stumble they do every year. Further in the presentation, I would try to explain it as a mad dash compliance. One of the reasons for that is that it's very hard to make people care. There's no way to actually mandate caring. You can mandate controls, approaches, tools, but you cannot mandate doing a good job, checking for things every day, and actually building things. It's very hard to convince people who think they're being forced to do it to do a good job, which is some part of the reason to why continuous compliance doesn't always exist and doesn't always become compelling. Another nice view that I'm borrowing from my friend Josh Corman from 51 Group, who often talks about PCI and how to improve it, is the situation where many companies have to move from being barely okay and doing audits and thinking that they're doing a good job with security, which he visualized as one of the three piglets, all the way to being somewhat okay, industry average, and then going all the way to doing a good job and really caring about not being breached and possibly being compliant. So I like the visualization because it makes it very clear that many organizations have to move and progress from the typical laggard house-made of hay situation to more advanced defenses which would really protect them and make them compliant. And thanks for Josh for the picture. Another interesting paradigm that I would unfortunately have to skip because we got a bit of an interruption is to remember that what you would do here is PCI-DSS, as well as many other regulatory mandates, are built to stop attacks, to reduce risk, and to reduce badness. Now, admittedly, not in all cases that's your badness, because if you lose cards, issuer would often take a loss, or some other entity. So the thing is, they're still built to reduce the risk for somebody. They're not built to reduce the risk of an audit. Audit mad dash only helps against the QSA, to make QSA sort of go away happy, or occasionally not happy, but content. A much more useful way to think about PCI and to start to get to that continuous theme is to remember PCI was built against the former, not against the latter. Now, to summarize what we learned today, I want to present a view of mad dash compliance versus continuous compliance. And I'm not trying to launch a new meme here, but maybe one will get off. If you only do it once a year, right before the QSA visit, Or if you don't do it because you just answer yes to all the questions in the self-assessment questionnaire, and sorry to break it for you, but that's not that uncommon. You sort of don't spend the time, you solve the immediate problem, the assessor, but at the same time, you don't get any of the benefits of the compliance and security program. You do not help security because clearly, if you do security only for 2 weeks in a year, that's not doing security. On the other hand, continuous compliance would solve many problems, would improve security, would reduce cost over time. That's been proven by some recent industry research. I read the fascinating report from Ponemon Institute about cost of compliance a couple of weeks ago, and it does show that reduced breach costs do follow from more frequent assessments and more frequent reviews of compliance posture. But there are some important cons to the continuous compliance which compel people sometimes to not do it. Namely, it takes time every day. You actually have to do it. You have to spend some effort doing this. And that to me is more of an education and motivation problem, not a problem of how to mandate carrying or how to mandate people deem strategic and thoughtful about compliance. Another metaphor to try to convince your management to invest into continuous compliance is this one. For the mad dash, audit, assessment, fail, another mad dash, another audit, pass, oh, see you in a year, we're done, versus build technology and process, automate, operationalize, and then pretty much cruise through audits, assessments every year. Obviously, all the numbers are made up, but the illustration is here. If you choose to do it the mad dash route, you're not going to get any of the benefits, and you will save some time, that is for sure. Well, you would save time until at least you're breached. Versus building the technology and processes, because PCI is not about buying boxes, as you at this point probably know. It's also about using the systems, operationalizing, internalizing the controls, and actually doing things, not just buying things and deploying things and sort of connecting them to racks and connecting wires to them. Think about this. Requirement 12 talks about incident response planning as well as executing on those incident response plans. So that's kind of one of those take-your-pick situations. Another argument I sometimes use to convince management is that if you do have your mad dash approach to compliance once a year, you're really not compliant. You are not compliant, and maybe your QSA wouldn't call you on that, but if you're doing it once a year only, you are certainly breaking the controls which have to be done daily. So that's kind of, I guess I can call it fake compliance because you're really not compliant. And at one point, your QSA might say, well, where is the evidence of that daily log review? And my presumption would be the companies who do it as a mad dash wouldn't be able to present such evidence. And I humorously and somewhat cynically, I guess, say, take a pick, you too can be a data breach story on CNN, because, and this, by the way, doesn't mean that compliance would guarantee that you would never be breached. What I'm saying is that mad dash compliance done every year would do nothing to reduce such chance. It's not like you're going to get 100% security from continuous compliance. That's a little silly to think that. What I'm saying is that you're going to get zero security increase from your mad dash compliance. Recently, I read a couple of interesting reports about how tactical short-term thinking kills businesses. PCI, done just to get a QSA off your backs, is really the best example or the most painful example of tactical short-term, let's solve that problem and then figure out how to live later kind of thinking. And I kind of hate to see when a CEO would say, oh, we want to be strategic, and then suddenly turns around and says, well, get the QSA out, and then let's continue on with our insecure practices. So this kind of low level and sort of a somewhat weak and second tier argument is still useful occasionally because guess what? Management sometimes likes to be strategic, and they like to actually say that their companies are thinking and doing things, and not just reducing the pain when it comes and then going back their own painful ways. So how do you become continuously compliant? How do you assess or audit yourself every day? Now, if you start thinking about assessments, audits, seeing your QSA friend every day, maybe for drinks, that's not the way to do it. Annual assessment is one side of the spectrum, but continuous or proactive assessment is really called monitoring. And you've been probably doing it already for operational reasons, for measuring uptime and not many other things. So continuous assessments and checking whether you're compliant every day really is called monitoring. And by the way, here I'm going to present my final argument to get people to think of compliance as well as security as an ongoing process. Can you get attackers to attack only once a year, like auditors? Now, if there's a meme I want to launch, that would be this one. You have two choices. Either you get attackers to switch to annual attacks, just like QSAs. QSAs come every year, hackers come hit you once a year. And then you can do security once a year. Sure, that's fine. Now, the other choice is to monitor all the time, because unlike assessors, unlike government auditors, unlike other people who come to check your compliance, attackers happen to be operating on a 24/7 schedule, 24/7, 365 kind of schedule. So unless you can get attackers to switch to annual attacks, and to be really honest, I'm not sure how you're going to do that. Your only choice is to monitor and essentially assess, audit yourself pretty much every day. There's no way to do it. Now, I'm not showing my famous kitten, PCI kitten slide here, but I'm going to use the other picture which I present to get people to think about PCI and security as an ongoing pursuit. Everything you do for PCI-DSS must have security benefit. Preparing for an assessment by painting over your grass, duct taping firewall label to servers, as well as doing many other ridiculous things, which, by the way, are all real and were supposed to bring companies into compliance, does not do security. So do it the other way. Do it in such a way that does help security. And it will allow you to actually live to see the other day. Learn these two words, operationalize and internalize. The way you use those two words and the way you use those two concepts is to absorb compliance in the ongoing process. Stop compliance is being done to me. It's being done by you every day. Compliance and security is something that's done by you, not to you. Even though, yeah, many merchants would like to think that big bad brands get them to become compliant, and they'd rather sell coffee and, gas and rent rooms and whatever else the main business is. Unfortunately, in today's environment, if you want to be on the internet, connected to public networks, whatever else, you will have to do security, and you will have to become PCI compliant and stay compliant, by the way, not just become PCI compliant. Some of the conclusions and action items, and sorry for the delay with technology. After validating that you're compliant, don't stop. Compliance is continuous. So in that sense, continuous compliance is a bit of an oxymoron because validation is periodic, compliance is continuous. That's how it was intended to be. And that's your goal, not passing an audit. What helps with that is developing a security and risk mindset. And by the way, when you do that, do remind yourself that attackers work all the time and assessors and auditors only work once a year. So if you can get your attackers to switch to annual attacks, sure, you're fine with compliance and audit mindset. You have to kill this whole auditor-resistant security. Security should be attacker-resistant and not just auditor-resistant. Learn to internalize and operationalize compliance and thus gain security benefits that come only from continuous compliance. Thanks a lot. I'm going to hand off the presentation to Mel from NitroSecurity, who will talk about how his tools and solutions help with continuous compliance.
All right. Thank you very much, Anton, and good afternoon to all of you. Since we are running at pretty late today, it's about 1:40, what I'm going to do is speak for the next 20 minutes, and if we don't get a chance for live Q&A, please make sure that you at least type your questions in the chat window, so Anton or myself will definitely answer those questions for you. Okay. Now, Anton, you really hit the nail on the head, and I must say pretty hard. It is really up to all of us whether we want to be leaders or laggards. Now, what was not possible before is now possible. Okay? So proactive compliance, which was a theoretical exercise, is now an achievable goal with the new technologies we have access to today. Okay? Compliance does not have to be equal to an audit. There's enough evidence and commentary, and Anton went on the benefits of being proactive rather than being reactive. Okay? So proactive compliance, when plotted on a timeline, should look like this red line, which is almost parallel to the baseline. The little dips are simply minor faults, say in the log collection process. Operations or internal audit should get a near real-time event when something does go wrong to help correct the fault. Now, is this what the security operations do or should be doing? Is this not what internal auditors should do or be doing? Okay, that is, make corrections as they go along instead of wait for their quarterly or annual audits. Now, what we are after is a continuous feedback loop. So the prerequisite for proactive compliance must be real-time information gathering. And how can we get continuous output if the input is discrete? Well, we cannot. So today, SIM, or Security Information and Event Management, is the enabling technology for real-time information gathering. Now, without a SIM, we cannot achieve proactive compliance. But that's not all what we need from a SIM. Another important step is ensuring the continuous feedback loop. It includes all the stakeholders, the policy owners and the policy implementers, okay, the internal audit and the security operations. And how do we do that when they use different tools and talk different languages and only interact with each other discreetly just before an audit? Well, we can ensure that the SIM unifies the parties and promotes collaboration, and this we can do using a unified taxonomy. Okay? The SIM notifies all the parties on the events, whether it is a breakdown of a logging control or whether it is a threat. So things can get moving on all sides instantly. A threat should not only prompt the security operations to begin an investigation, but also prompt internal audit and the board of directors regarding the breakdown of controls. Okay. Now, of course, the logging tool has to be smart, okay? And SIMs typically have the smarts. You can't produce any useful information, any useful notifications or reports from raw log data. Okay? User Bob or root logged into IP address 1234. It does not mean anything for a person in internal audit. A SIM must send a notification suggesting that the access is inappropriate because the user is not on the IT admin network, but still he is using privileged credentials and accessing a high-risk system. Then it is an actionable event and useful for achieving our goal of proactive compliance. Without context, data is raw and incomprehensible. Now, isn't one of our objectives of compliance to detect fraud and theft and have the evidence to support an investigation? But the logs you're collecting don't necessarily have all the information. So let me ask, do you have logs on what documents were exchanged by users, what was in the response of a database query, or the subject of a webmail or instant message communications? Well, if you don't, then you are essentially blind to a significant wealth of information. Okay? However, there is ample information on the network, just waiting to be tapped. Okay? A lot of this information is transient, and if not saved, it is gone forever. Therefore, incorporating database activity monitoring, application monitoring, file integrity monitoring, data leakage monitoring into the SIM is essential. Only then can you address questions like how many database records were accessed and did they have cardholder data? Who did the perpetrator chat with and send emails to and what was in those emails? So I lay a stake in the ground and say that this content capture is needed for proactive compliance. Now, how can we measure if things are different? If we can't have a historical context around all the activity? Daily, weekly, monthly, and on-demand baselines is the answer. Baselines tell you when things are getting better or they're getting worse. Deviation from a baseline can tell you proactively when a logging control is not working or when a user has performed actions that he usually does not. These are all relevant events that must be noticed by policy owners and policy implementers without delay, and therefore baselines are essential for proactive compliance. I feel the same about risk scoring. PCI 2.0 requirement 6.2 makes a case for a risk-based approach. Essentially, it is telling you to focus on what's important. In this screenshot, the organization has taken the time to classify their file servers as unclassified and sensitive. Now the SIM lets them focus and report on risk. The risk score can be on an asset, asset attributes, asset vulnerability, type of event, user role, or any other source that can provide enrichment information. Okay? It could be a list of point of sale systems at your retail locations that have been hacked in the past. Or it could simply be a watch list provided by your fraud department. So I again lay the stake that risk scoring is essential to proactive compliance. Okay? Now all of this, finally, all the information has to come together. Logs, unified taxonomy, context, content, risk-based scoring, baselines. And once you have all of this, then you can achieve your goal of proactive compliance. So here's how we address the challenge at NitroSecurity to make proactive compliance a reality. Okay? What you see on the screen is our Enterprise Security Manager, or ESM, which is the essential component of the SIM. To the SIM, we have something called collectors, which collect data from different kinds of data sources. The Enterprise Log Manager, which gives you compliant log storage, is part of the package. These can all be on the same appliance, or they can be on different appliances. Okay? And all of these communicate through secure channels. Okay. Now, going back to our discussion of context and content, one of the primary components that we add to the SIM is the NitroView database monitor. Okay? This gives you insight into the transactions. Who is accessing what data? Did the response contain credit card numbers in them? How many? And whether it is Oracle or SQL or Sybase, all of these are covered. The next piece that we added, and we're the first vendor to do this, is the application data monitor. Okay? And what this gives you essentially is lets you tap into your network for things that were not available in logs. Web chat sessions, people accessing Facebook and other websites, watching those communications, instant message communications, P2P file transfers may be occurring through unauthorized applications. All of this information is being monitored, including who's printing on the network on a weekend. The NitroGuard IPS is also an integral part of the solution, which is an inline device which sits close to the perimeter, and it protects from malware, viruses, and Trojans. And all of this together forms the NitroView solution. Now, why NitroSecurity? Why select NitroSecurity? Okay. We, NitroSecurity as a vendor, got into the SIM space about 3.5 years ago. And as of 2010, end of 2010, we were the #1 SIM solution by NSC Magazine, and we are the first company to be inducted in the Hall of Fame. Okay. We were also rated the #1 log management solution by InfoWorld Technology of the Year Award for 2010 as well. Okay. And there's a bunch of papers out there suggesting that we have the leading performance, which will be a key requirement of all SIMs when they start capturing enough context and content. And our goal has been real-time compliance and real-time security. And this is one of the key challenges that we took on, which was essentially not achieved by the first generation SIMs. Okay? You can find us as a leading vendor, leading visionary vendor on the Gartner Quadrant. And we have certifications today for FIPS 140-2 and EAL Common Criteria Level 3 certifications as well. Okay. So this is a little bit background about us, and these are a few of our customers. And at this point, we still have 10 minutes of questions. Isn't that fantastic?
Thanks so much, Mel. I do have some questions that did come in from the audience. First being, there is no two-factor authentication method in place for remote access. Does the two-factor authentication only apply to the PCI servers in scope, if these servers are segregated from the rest of the network?
Yes. Okay, that's actually a good one, because sometimes people read the requirement about two-factor as it has to be there for the whole network, and sometimes people read it as it has to only apply to the actual PCI scope service. And I mean, I have to use the usual disclaimer that the only authoritative source is your QSA, but I've seen this interpreted as only apply to the servers under PCI, not remote access to any part of the network. Now, with subject to the caveat about QSAs, I think that's perfectly logical, because if you have a server that has nothing to do with cardholder data and that is separated from the payment network, I do not see why PCI would mandate two-factor auth on that server.
Okay, and next question I have too is, visitors are not required to wear a badge when on site for an organization which provides education. Does the badge and sign-in requirement only pertain to visitors who are visiting the employee? Would we be okay if we separate the education facility from the employee's area with a card swipe?
To be honest, not sure how to handle this one. Let's see. This is probably the impact of this would be, I mean, the requirement 9 physical access control, and I don't really see this as applicable to outside of cardholder environment. Now, if you happen to have the whole network, whole environment to be cardholder data environment, I can see how it would apply everywhere, but this is probably limited to only the cardholder data environment. But this is something I haven't experienced, so you should take my comments with a grain of salt.
Okay, and another question that came into is backup tapes are not stored at an alternate site or commercial storage facility for this particular person's question. What constitutes an alternate site? Could an employee's home or branch office count?
There's no detail about this in the standard itself, as far as I remember, but I have seen people. Okay, so I've seen it in organizations that haven't done the assessment. So I've seen it where it was never subjected to a QSA test. But I don't see why you cannot build it as an acceptable case. But there would be some concerns about whether what's on those tapes, whether they're encrypted or not, and how they're stored. So I kind of hate to recommend using somebody's basement infested with rats as storage for backup tapes, but there is nothing in the standard that makes you send them to Iron Mountain only. I mean, there are many other ways to do that, I'm sure.
Okay, next question.
Well, it does say secure location. I just rechecked my 9.5 here, requirement 9.5, and it's so. I mean, if you can make a case that your basement with the, annual flooding, rats, and pets is a secure location, then good luck to you, but I somehow doubt you'd be able to do that.
Thank you, Anton. And another question that came in is a scenario. We are trying to automate our PCI compliance checking. We are using HP's PCI audit policies to check our servers for PCI compliance. We found that using HP's policy, we have a number of non-compliant issues. Yet if we use another vendor's audit policy, we will get different results of non-compliance. The different vendors check different things. Our only solution is to modify the vendor solution to align with our organizational standards. What is your opinion on this? How do we guarantee compliance if each vendor has its own interpretation?
Okay. Well, you hit one of the well-known sort of a compliance controversies, I guess I can say. Well, if vulnerability scanners, as you know, are somewhat regulated because you have ASVs, they have specific or somewhat specific requirements for PCI policies. Now, if you talk about configuration assessment, like scanning internal systems for PCI policy statements, these aren't regulated, and there's no standard about how to do that. Every vendor reads the document and, to the best of their ability, creates a PCI scan policy, a PCI audit policy. So, unfortunately, I don't have any pleasant answer for you that if you use one tool and it has been accepted by an assessor, by your assessor, that would probably be, that would be the official answer. If you have two tools and you use both of them and one shows that you're not compliant, My guess is that you have to act on this because otherwise it would seem like you're negligent. On the other hand, if you continuously see that one tool just isn't performing or is finding mistakes or is otherwise wrong in many cases, there's nothing that will stop you from discontinuing the use of the tool, right? So that's probably as much of an answer I can give in this case. But keep in mind that this is vendor's opinion. Unlike vulnerability scanning, all other tools are just a subject of vendor's reading of PCI. There's nothing else there.
Thank you. And next question was, what types of profiles are available to establish a baseline PCI monitoring in the SIM?
That's probably a Melum question. I mean, I can tell you what different SIM vendors do, but I suspect that's a Mel question.
Okay.
Mel?
Let me handle that. So for one, we talked about some of the features today, risk-based correlation and the baselines and other things. But one of the primary features, of course, is the ability to, have, the rules that are available for PCI monitoring. Okay, so almost all SIM vendors will provide that default rule set, the default report set, to be able to look at the controls at a high level. Now, what is happening right now is, it's not just about rules, it's also about risk-based monitoring, and often rules themselves are not good enough for that purpose. So one of the concepts that we are exploring now and introducing is a rule-less engine. A completely risk-based correlation engine. And what that really does is different forms of enrichment can be made available for figuring out whether this activity is normal or not normal. Because that is, one of the root things that you're trying to figure out with your SIM is whether there is any chance of fraud or any chance of threat that is going undiscovered by the rule set, because rules are usually hard to maintain. Okay. Does that answer the question?
There was actually a second part question from the same person. And what type of information is available to customize rules to reflect real conditions? Okay.
So there's always some tuning involved. So the base rule set, along with the other features like, for example, baselines, right? They help you. They get you started with proactive compliance, and then. Depending on your environment, you essentially what you want to do is you want to create some form of whitelist. Okay, that once you know that this is my application, this is my application universe, which comprises of these users and these client machines and these database servers. You have to get to a point where you can filter out the noise and see the exceptional activity clearly. And pretty much all SIM vendors, with their rule sets, they allow options to customize them. So for example, the default rule set might be suggesting that a database query is pulling out credit card records. But that may be normal because it's the application. So you probably want to go there and add a clause saying that, well, if it comes from this application name or this IP address, then it's okay. But and look for anybody else doing that same activity or similar activity.
And I do have a few more questions. The next one is a comment on RFC 1918 and IPv6 related to non-published network addresses.
Comment, yeah. I mean, I would probably like to hear a more specific question about what specific PCI challenge they mean. As you know, IPv6 isn't. Oh, I think I know where it's going. Well, at this point, PCI-DSS isn't really IPv6 aware. So we might have another debacle in our hands similar to virtualization. Namely that in IPv6 networks, you'd obviously do some things different than is on NAT. But PCI does talk about NAT and does not talk about IPv6. Okay, my guess is that you'd be on your own on this because this until and unless PCI standard changes it and adds references to IPv6 specific controls, which would happen the earliest in 2 years, you would have to, deal with it. And sorry for a non-answer, but that's the only answer I can give.
And do we have time for a few more questions? If not, I do have a copy of the transcript, and we can have you address those individually if you'd like. Would we like to wrap things up, Anton and Mel?
I see actually one really interesting question that I do need to, I think would be very useful to the audience as well as for future webcast, recording session kind of people. One question is, we are not directly involved with any of the businesses related here to PCI, but we do accept credit cards to charge our clients. Should we be PCI compliant? Yes. If you accept cards, you have a merchant account, you should be PCI compliant. That's a completely unambiguous, easy answer, and that is the truth.
Fantastic. Absolutely. On that note, Anton, did you have anything to add?
No, that's it.
Fantastic. And our audience, we really want to thank you for hanging in there with us on the webcast. And thank you so much to Anton and Mel for your presentations. And a special thanks to NitroSecurity for bringing this content to the SANS community. And to our audience, we really appreciate you listening in. And for a schedule of all upcoming and archived webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. And until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.